Welcome to Directionally Correct, a people analytics podcast with Cole and Scott. Today's guest, Steve Hunt, founder of i3 Talent and author of Talent Tectonics. Hey, Directionally Correct fans. If you're looking to stay connected to the podcast, make sure to subscribe to our Substack newsletter, watch our videos on YouTube, or listen to the podcast on your app of choice. This podcast is dedicated to you to help educate and entertain you on how to effectively do people analytics. We are a listener-supported podcast, so please consider becoming a patron. If you'd like to support the podcast by becoming a patron, you can find a link to sign up in the show notes or at patron.podbean.com/directionallycorrect. Thanks for being a listener. All opinions are our own and do not reflect those of any other organization. In preparing for the podcast, you told me that you were actually early to the grunge scene in Seattle. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I grew up in Seattle, and I was in a punk rock band. Even I want to say the name, Uncle Wiggily and the Screaming Prophylactics. That was the name of the punk rock band I was in. And it was kind of
a lot to put on a T-shirt.
Yeah, it was kind of just a reason. As my friend said, we were going to get together and drink beer. Why don't we get together, drink beer, and make a lot of noise? And so I was in this band, and we did perform. And this was when grunge was just all starting, right? And this is how close I was to hitting the big time. I was at a concert where we opened for a band that became a band that turned into a band that became Soundgarden.
So there you go.
Yeah, I was that far away from making it. And I did. And another funny story, one of my best friends is a recording engineer and actually recorded Pearl Jam. He was one of the people on the albums. And this was like 10 years later, so I'm in my 30s. And I was going to see my friend Sam at the recording studio, and Pearl Jam was recording there. And so I briefly met Eddie Vedder, and he is a really nice guy. People always say about that. But they said, my friends say, hey, we're going to go out to have some burgers. And it was with Stone Gossard, if you know these names, Kip Tyler from Soundgarden, and I can't remember his name, but the bass player from Mudhoney. And we went out, and these are all bands I listened to, and we were just like hanging out and talking. And the funny thing is that they're the same age, right? We're all in the same age. We spent most of the time talking about kitchen remodeling and childcare.
Well, yeah, what I hear you saying, Steve, is if Kurt Cobain were still alive, you would be what he looked like. So,
yeah, I don't know. I just thought it was really funny because I remember coming back from talking to these guys in the 30s and just nice guys, right? And it was just like hanging out and talking to people. But then I was working in HR at that time at Starbucks with a lot of, HR younger women in their 20s. And I was like, oh, yeah, I just met Eddie Vedder. I was hanging out with Stone Gossard. They were just like, oh, my gosh. Because this was when Pearl Jam was like super popular. So, yeah, that's my brush with fame. I'm sure they don't remember me at all, but I remember them.
Well, I'm sure there's plenty of folks now in the HR space that feel the same about you, Steve. You're a big cat, which is probably a good transition. I know you're a multiple time author, but your most recent book, Talent Tectonics, came out not that long ago. And before you get into it, I wanted to tee you up to how I came across Talent Tectonics. So some friends of mine told me that they had a book club and they were reading this book, Talent Tectonics, and I kept kind of overtly and covertly asking for an invite to this group to read the book. Never got one. And so my retribution is I was like, well, I'll just invite the author on the podcast since you won't invite me to your book club. So I've read your book. It's great. But can you talk to me a little bit about what is what's the thesis behind Talent Tectonics and what makes it interesting and different?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you for sharing that story that was included in a book club. I mean, writing books as an author, it's a very lonely thing. And I'm always writing, going, I hope somebody reads this and likes it. So whenever I hear that people read it, I probably shouldn't act so pleasantly surprised that people actually read these books, but I'm always like, wow, that's really cool. That's, makes you feel good. The reason I wrote Talent Tectonics, and I kind of joke, it's my third in my HR trilogy adventure stories. It's the third book I've written, but it's based off of my work. I kind of have had a pretty interesting career, I think. It's more common now, but it wasn't when I started. So when I started out as a computer programmer before I became an IO psychologist. I would say I wasn't a very good computer programmer. And then but because I was always around technology, my career is always focused on how can we use technology to apply psychological principles to work? And I've been, was recognized. That's what I was recognized as a fellow in IO psychology for, was advancing the application of psychology through the use of technology. And in my work, it's been just working with literally, in this point, thousands of companies on using technology to try to solve different work problems. And I wrote Talent Tectonics because I was seeing the same issues coming up in lots and lots of companies. And I was kind of a unique perspective as a psychologist working in the technology field with companies across all these different industries. And I wanted to make sense of it. Largely, I write stuff to make sense to myself. It helps me organize stuff and make sense of it. And so with Talent Tectonics, really, because there's all this stuff around future of work and changing work and all these different changes, I sort of said, well, what's actually happening? And I looked at patterns, kind of looking at historical context. And what the book really focuses on is its focus on how is the nature of work being fundamentally changed by what I call talent tectonic forces, and how do we need to respond to this, in part using technology, but also taking into account the one thing about work that isn't changing, which is the fundamental psychology of people. That it's the only constant thing, I would argue, about work is the psychology of people, because we don't evolve that fast. I mean, there are differences from one generation to the next in terms of, expectations and familiar with technology and obviously, but the basic things that make us happy and engaged and productive don't change. I always say that's why plays like by Shakespeare written 500 years ago are still relevant to us, because they deal in fundamental psychological truths. So that's what the book kind of looks at, that intersection. But specifically, Talent Tectonics, it's an analogy to plate tectonics. Living in the Northwest on the West Coast, we have earthquakes, and these plates are always moving. You can't see them move, but you see the result of their movement in the formation of mountain ranges and things like that, earthquakes, stuff like that. You can think of work in the same way, that there are fundamental shifts. They don't just change work, they change society, but they particularly have a big impact on work. And that's what talent tectonics, the concept, means. And so, like, to give an example, before I get into the two big ones that are affecting us now, in the 20th century, the two big talent tectonic changes were the workers' rights movement. There was no occupational health and safety in 1900. Companies used to actually factor in how many people were going to be killed on the job when they would do workforce planning. It was just like a cost of operation. And there was a fundamental shift in society about obligations of employees to employers, or rather, employers to employees, union organization, labor rights, which was not gentle, right? That, governments fell. It was a massive transformation. The U.S. mobilized the army to shoot union organizers. People don't really know this history, but a lot of things we take for granted as just work, 40-hour work week, all that other stuff, massive society.
Battle of Blair Mountain.
Yeah. Just, I think it would benefit our society as a whole if people had more of a history of how we got where we are. But and that's that we still living out that shifted our nature, our very nature of how we view work and what work is. And the same thing, the other big one in the 20th century was the education and entry of women into the professional workforce, which again has radically shifted society. We still have a long way to go with gender equity, but when you look at how much society's changed, that's what I mean by talent tectonic shift. And the two big ones that are playing out now, digitalization of everything, technology permeating every aspect of work and life, and demographics, specifically that there's more people aging out of a lot of labor markets and entering into them, because people know that our birth rates have been going down, but I think sometimes they don't realize how much. I mean, it's like dropped by more than 2/3 in many parts of the world, and we're living longer. So the book looks at work from the perspective of how those two things are changing the nature of work and the nature of labor markets, and how we need to rethink work and how companies are rethinking it, managing a world of accelerating change and chronic skill shortage.
And how much does it cover things like, as a part of that technology shift, like what's going on with AI? In preparation for this podcast, you told me that your dad actually wrote one of the first books on AI, which I thought was fascinating. How does that align to kind of some of the tectonic plate shifts that are going on in the book?
It's funny, actually, in your time that I have that book right here.
Oh, that's wild. What's it called?
It is called, I'll hold it up to the screen, Artificial Intelligence.
There you go.
1975.
Good luck finding that on Google right now.
Oh my gosh, yeah. What AI is doing is it's accelerating the digitalization shift that was already happening. It's not changing the direction of it, it's expanding it. And it's accelerating it. I think the way that I would talk about AI, it's what's overwhelming us is how fast it's happening. Imagine if we'd gone from the iPhone 1 to the iPhone 15 in 2 years. you know.
Yeah.
And you think about it, that our society has been massively transformed by things like the internet and mobile, but it happened it happened fast, but more slowly than AI. AI is just happening so quickly. Well, one thing is interesting, actually, my dad, when he wrote that book in 1975, and it was a look at the mathematics that underlie AI, which has been around for a long time, the basic mathematics of AI. And in the book, he actually said the math works for natural language processing. Computers just aren't fast enough. This problem will be solved. And then 50 years later, here we are. But I think the way that I look at AI and this impact of technology and that shift, the digitalization shift, what's happening is the purpose of work is fundamentally being changed in society. If you look at, 250 years ago during the agricultural age, the main reason people worked was to grow and distribute food so we didn't starve to death. That was the main purpose of work. Then in the Industrial Revolution, we got much more effective at growing and distributing food. So a lot of the purpose of work shifted from growing food so we don't die to building things that make us comfortable, clothing, cars, houses, stuff like that. But now with digitalization and automation, the bulk of jobs are what are called knowledge and service work now. And what's the purpose of a knowledge and service job? You're basically supposed to solve problems or provide care that make people feel good about what it is you're doing for them. Your job is really to exceed people's expectations. And their expectations are constantly changing. And so the purpose of work is to deal with the stuff that the technology can't do, which is when the technology doesn't work, or finding new ways to use the technology, or making people feel good about their experiences with these services. When you look at the purpose of work being your job is to exceed other people's expectations, which are constantly shifting, what has happened is work has become physically, over the last 50 years, work is physically much, much easier. Anyone who tells you work was better 50 years ago did not work 50 years ago. It literally shortened people's lives. It just wore you down. Work now is physically easier, but it's psychologically a lot more difficult, because what you're being asked to do is you're being asked to deal with all these changes, keep up with all these things. And AI is just fully even more accelerating that. And Cole, you're familiar with this concept of emotional labor, the exhaustion of trying to act one way when you don't feel that way internally. That's why we're seeing these rising increases in burnout and stress and disengagement and all these other things, is that people are sort of struggling to keep up. And it's also why employee experience has become so important, because I want to really always focus this. To me, employee experience, sometimes people talk about it as engagement and retention. Yeah, if people aren't engaged and they don't stick around, they're not going to be effective. But they can't do their job. They can't be creative, caring, collaborative, all that stuff companies want people to do if they're burned out, exhausted, or stressed. That's a lot of what this book talks about. It talks about how do we need to rethink work and how companies are. And it's based on my experience with lots and lots of companies doing this stuff. How do we need to rethink work using technology to provide better employee experiences that tap into, which is another thing the book talks about, people's unbelievable capacity for dealing with change. One of the biggest myths about people is people fear change. It's they don't fear change. We fear bad change. We fear bad things happening to us. We're skeptical, as going back to being little monkeys in the trees. Change makes us nervous, but we thrive on it. That's the competitive niche of humans, is our ability to adapt to changing work environments. Changing environments in general, right? To adapt to changing environments. We're really good at it. It's called learning. It's innate. It's the only thing. When kids are born, all they know how to do is eat, poop, and learn. And I kind of joke, and they're really good at all three if you've ever had kids.
Yeah.
But as a parent, you don't teach your kids how to learn. You create this environment, and it's just a joy to do it. But the problem is that in the industrial age, particularly, everything was focused on productivity, and we're most productive when we're doing stuff we already know how to do in a repetitive manner. Well, all the productivity work is being automated, and AI is just accelerating that. So now what we want people to do is all this stuff that's about adaptability, and the psychological conditions that make people good at dealing with change are very different from the psychological conditions focused on productivity.
Yeah, did you ever read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow?
I did read it. It's been quite a while.
Okay. But he talks about system 1 versus system 2 thinking. And the system 2 thinking is very cognitively taxing for human beings. We don't enjoy it. We try to avoid it at all costs, but it's kind of where the roots of things like creativity come from, critical thinking, actually weighing the pros and cons of something, but also thinking about things like adapting to change. Right. And so you could almost say that we're hardwired to not want to adapt to change, because we would prefer system 1 thinking, which is more rote, doing what you did yesterday, not really thinking, having heuristics and all of those types of things. So I don't know. I find that to be fascinating. But you've mentioned a few times things like productivity and what does the future of work look like. You've done a ton of work in your career with talent and performance management. And I get questions all the time about like, what are the top HR metrics that we should be tracking? And I always think like there are no top HR metrics. The real metrics are questions that are really hard to answer, like how can we quantify people's productivity or how can we quantify things like quality of hire? Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I can. And before I get into that, because it's really important, I want to go back to what you talked about Kahneman stuff, because I don't completely agree
Yeah,
with him about we don't like to do system one thinking. I think the thing
system two.
is that often we think of it as work because of the way it's presented, and we're concerned that we're going to fail. And that's kind of fear of change. We don't fear change, we do fear punishment. And the most punishing part of change is inability to cope with it. But if you create the right conditions for people, people thrive on change. And the right conditions are basically one, the change has to be meaningful to them. They have to understand, how is this going to help me get what I want out of life? And that's not just money. That can be fulfillment. It can be spending time with their family. When it comes to work, money's part of work, but it's the nature of the job. The second thing is we're social animals. And when we're dealing with change, it's particularly really important that we feel supported for it, that we have a group that's like wants us to be successful and is looking out for us. So if we have a sense of camaraderie and belongingness, and the third one is we have to be confident we can do it, self-efficacy, right? That we have the tools and resources. When people have those three things, I understand why I'm doing this and how it's meaningful to me. I'm working with people that are helping me to do it and want me to be successful. And I'm confident I got the stuff I need to make it happen. We thrive on change. I always say the example, think in your own career. Probably some of the most exciting times, enjoyable times of your career were times of significant change, new projects, new assignments, but you had those three things. And yeah, it was stressful, but it was good stress. It was the stress of getting stuff done with other people, which is a positive
Yeah.
thing. So when you have that, we thrive on system one thinking. The problem is, historically, work environments didn't really provide it that way, and change wasn't introduced that way. But I do a lot of
Yeah, it's like the
presentations.
whole Hackman and Oldham, job characteristics model of autonomy, mastery, purpose. You get all those things, it makes things better. Totally agree.
Yeah. And this is basic psychology. This is, McClellan's need for achievement, need for affiliation, Bandura's self-efficacy, new psychology. But when I talk about this, I do a lot of presentations and speaking and stuff like that. I do a little interactive exercise where I ask people if they've ever been river rafting, and I bring somebody up on stage, yeah, I've been river rafting. I always ask, did you enjoy it? They come up. And then I go through this whole process. I'm like, did you enjoy it? Yeah. I'm like, did you realize did you pay money to do it? They're like, yeah, I didn't have to do it, but I wanted to do it. I'm like, did you realize you could drown and die? And they're like, well, yeah. I'm like, you've paid money to introduce change into your life that could have killed you, but
Yeah,
you
wasn't there,
had
like,
the
some famous
main thing.
psychologist that talked about everybody who has, like, a death wish or something like that? I
No,
don't know,
it's
I feel
more
like that's, like, Freudian stuff, but yeah.
I wouldn't get in the fray. I think it's more people going back to the joy of being a little child. We thrive. We love it when we're doing new stuff and we have those three things. And I think that's the problem, is that we train people and we fall into this laziness and happiness. It's interesting. If you look at a lot of there's a reason why the word meaningless is a synonym for depression. Because if we're
Mhm.
not working on things that give us a sense of achievement, we become despondent and lethargic. So are we wired to be lazy to some degree? Yeah, that is true. But if you fall into that and you create a condition where people can indulge their laziness, it's unhealthy. And I think that's what this book gets so much into, this discussion of, as I put it, how do we use, and largely I focus on how leveraging technology and other things too, but how do we create this environment where workers have this sense of, yeah, there's a lot going on, but it's good change. And it comes back to meaning, belongingness, and confidence.
Yeah, so it's
But
like the difference between eustress and distress. Same, both of them are stressors, one is positive, one is negatively laden.
yeah. And if any one of those three things drops below a certain level, we go from sort of this like growth excitement mindset to survival terror. Going back to my like river rafting example, if you didn't know why you were on the boat, if you're on the boat with a bunch of people who didn't care about you, or the boat didn't float, it would not be a fun trip.
Yeah,
Right.
when you're in the boat, trip is going well. When you're not in the boat, by not your own choice, trip is not going well, And terror ensues.
Yeah, and so that's a lot what the book gets into it, and it looks at how we need to rethink how we design jobs, how we need to rethink how we hire people, how we need to rethink how we coach people, and it kind of looks at a lot of different examples. But getting to back to the question that you asked, I feel like one of those like presidential debates. Allow me to completely ignore the question you ask and go off on my own talk track. Um,
If you want to, Steve. I mean, we're
no,
not debating, but if you want to, we can.
no, I want to answer the question that you asked. I just wanted to. The thing you said about Kahneman was really interesting because I never thought about that. I disagreed with him, but when you pointed it out, I'm realizing I don't totally agree with him on that. I agree with him on pretty much everything else, which I'm sure he's really relieved to hear.
Yeah, he was been waiting. He's like, when is Steve going to come around that my Nobel Prize winning economics ideas, even though I was classically trained as a psychologist, I wonder when that Steve Hunt guy is going to come around and give me my due.
And tell me, did I earn this Nobel Prize? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I had random. I don't. Can we go off on random stories every so often? Because you triggered one. I
Yeah.
had dinner with the 2019 Nobel laureate in physics, Dr. Gerard Moreau. Talk about one of the most amazing people I've ever met.
In what way? I don't know who that is, so you're going to have to.
And that's the thing. Everyone should. It bothers me as a society that you know who Kim Kardashian is and you don't know who Gerard Moreau is.
Well, if it makes you feel better, I wish I didn't know who Kim Kardashian was. So
That makes
there
me
you
feel a little bit better. That's true. Gerard Moreau, he invented something called high intensity pulse lasers, which I won't try to get into the whole physics of it, but they basically just concentrate insane amounts of power in very small doses. Like he said, if this thing was left on for a second, it would bring down the power grid of the East Coast. And it's these just super high intensity pulse lasers. And among other things, I mean, they're so high, they just literally obliterate stuff. They're like, I know you don't like Star Trek, but your colleague does. They're like, imagine photon torpedoes. They're for real. But
it's lost on me, Steve. I'm sorry. I warned you.
But among other things, it was like LASIK eye surgery as a result of this, which is a funny story. He told me how they came up with LASIK eye surgery. And as a former grad student, you'll appreciate this. They were in the lab working with these lasers, and one of the grad students got a laser in their eye, which is not as bad as it sounds. It can be, but it's like, and he goes, yeah, and the grad student, we said, we need to take you to the hospital. And the grad student's like, no, I don't want them to shut down the lab. He's like, what a good grad student, willing to sacrifice their eye to keep the research going. But he goes, no, I'm a good advisor. We got to go to the lab. We got to go to the hospital, rather. We go into the hospital, and
you were applauding the wins of the labor movement earlier, and now we're talking about shooting laser beams into graduate students' eyes as progress.
Well, the graduate student shot the laser into their own eye. So, okay, this is why we need occupational health and safety.
Yeah.
Because the grad student was not wearing the prescribed eye protection. So the problem was the fail of compliance of HR policies. But to finish this a fascinating story, so I was talking to this guy, was amazing, this Nobel laureate, Gerard Moreau, about all the stuff he's done. But he was telling me this story, and this is a great story of innovation, where they go into the emergency room, and I always get it wrong, the optometrist, ophthalmologist, the eye surgeon. I always confuse those two words. But the eye surgeon goes in and looks and says, yeah, it's a laser, we can fix it, it'll be all right. But then he goes, what kind of laser is this? I see these, fairly often, and usually it's like a ragged sort of burn mark. And this is an absolute perfect circle. And the guy goes, well, it's this high intensity pulse laser that we just developed. And the guy quit his job at the hospital, joined Moreau's lab, and they developed LASIK eye surgery because a grad student got a laser in their eye.
Well, I don't know what the moral of the story is, but that is
there's no moral. It's just when you talked about Nobel laureates, that triggered that story. So, okay, going back, and I've just listened to a lot of your podcasts, and I'm indulging myself in these stories because in Directionally Correct, I found that sometimes you guys weave into some pretty wide spectrum.
We meander. We're all over the place.
So, but getting back to your question about the measurement of like purpose of HR, it's really. Well, there's the two sides. There is the compliance side and all that sort of stuff. But the other side is to increase workforce productivity and, maximize value of the money you spend on people. And people are really expensive. I don't view that as a bad Machiavellian thing. I always say, like actually in my book, I say, look, good employee experiences don't come from working for failing companies. It's about how do you balance these two things. And I think the point that you got into is one of the biggest challenges for HR as a function is companies really struggle to measure the value of people. And the issue is, I think, with the HR issue is that the real value of employees, it's not measured in HR technology systems. I'll share a great story I had with it. It was the head of compensation for this big global manufacturing company. And he had implemented this technology. I worked, a lot of my jobs is helping companies sell HR technology and use HR technology. And so he had implemented our solution. And he was talking about how they used to have $500 million a year tied up in merit increases and bonuses. And he goes, it used to be managed on Excel spreadsheets. We had teams of people just trying to keep track of all this, this $500 million annual spend. And he goes, and then we moved to the cloud, and now we've got it like one person can keep track of it, and it's all in one place, and it's awesome. And I was like, well, that's good. That's great. But then I asked him, I said, what's the return on investment of that $500 million annual operating spend? And he looks at me and he kind of jokes. He goes, people don't quit too often. They don't complain too much. And we laughed. Can you imagine going to a CFO in any other field saying, I want to spend $500 million a year in perpetuity. And the bar is going to be people aren't going to quit and they're not going to complain. That is kind of where we largely are in the world of HR, because we don't pay people to be engaged, have skills, and not quit. Granted, if they don't have those things, they won't be productive. We pay them to drive sales, create customer service, but all that data is not measured in HR systems. And
can I dig into that for a second?
Yeah,
just because you're hitting on one of my like hot button things. So like if I have an HR tech vendor who markets to me, a lot of times they'll build like an ROI business case. And you know what they'll say is their ROI is that they reduce turnover and they increase employee engagement. Yep. Now that's basically the same thing as our people don't quit too often and our people are happy.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And in that HR tech vendor's use case, they're seeing that as a wild success. But you're saying now that the CFO is going to see this as this huge failure and waste of money. How do you square that circle?
Well, I don't think the CFO will see it as a huge failure and waste of money. They just see it, oh, well, that's just HR. HR can't actually demonstrate the real value of what it does beyond those two things. And in defense, too, if you don't have those two things, you're not going to get productivity and sales and all this other stuff, right? But when you're really trying to demonstrate the value, and I think a lot of really devastating workforce decisions are a result of us not being able to show that value. When you look at all the restructuring as a good example, there is tons of research that shows that restructuring obviously saves you a lot of money in the short term, but long term is not good for long-term company growth. But companies...
Can I actually dig into that right now?
Yeah.
Because like one of the things I see going on is there's a lot of restructuring going on. And like historically, and maybe this is just me looking at the past with, glossy eyes and thinking the past is better than the present. But it seemed like a lot of restructuring in the past was just due to like economics and maybe the market was turning south or something like that. Whereas right now it seems punitive a lot of times. And is that like sometimes it's like, hey, I don't like you guys, and therefore I'm going to fire a whole bunch of you. And do you see that at all, or maybe has it always been this way? And maybe I'm just looking at the past with rose-colored glasses.
Yeah, I don't know how much of it actually is punitive. I do think there's some examples of that. I do think most restructuring, and just having worked with a lot of leaders at the level, they don't want to do it. There's there are total asshole leaders out there, but thank goodness they're in the minority. Most executives are fundamentally good people. I think the thing is that they make this decision without an understanding of what they're doing. So I always like to say, ideally we should be able to measure what is the cost of not hiring somebody. You know? Because hire people to spend money on them, right? But we are really good at measuring all the money we spend on people, but really bad at measuring the value people provide, going on the fact that, again, it's not about being engaged and not quit. You'll see pockets where that's not true, like to some degree sales, although in salespeople get a lot of credit for stuff they probably didn't create, actually.
Nope.
But there's a little more of a tie, and that's historically. And when I look at what would really, really advance not just the field of HR, but just work in general and we have the technology to do this. And Cole, you and I were chatting before the show. You've done it in your own career, but it's really rare when it's done, which is when you link HR data to business operations data that's not in HR systems. It's in, what are called ERP systems. And I did actually a study where we went and we talked to a lot of companies that had done this and that had linked HR and non-HR data. And it was fascinating because I remember one example, a guy was in a call center environment. And he said, I had a belief that if people stayed longer, they sold more. They did what's called conversion on calls. He said, I kind of could look at tenure. And I knew that tenure was predicted in part by compensation. And so he did a study where he looked at how did pay rates influence engagement, but how did engagement and retention, particularly experience, influence customer conversion, so sales. And he was able to show that there was this optimal level of paying people. It was curvilinear. And he said that if we paid above market rate, to this point, we would make it up in increased revenue, not reduced turnover costs, increased revenue. But if we went beyond that point, we wouldn't make it up. Then the cost of labor was not worth what we'd get. And then he said, I was able to go into the CFO and make an argument why we should increase salaries above market rate. And it wasn't based on turnover, it was based on revenue. And then at the end, he goes, well, when I look at that, we should do that all the time. He goes, labor market rates, salaries are going up and down. This is a study we should be doing constantly and refining our pay rates based on how it impacts revenue. Because I've never done it again. It was so hard to get the data. It was so hard to pull it out. It was so hard to normalize it. And he goes, and so we never did it again. But that's the frustration. We could do it. We have the technological capability to do this. But it requires HR to, one, admit, we don't actually measure the value of people. We measure things that are necessary for their value, but also really pushing organizations that we need to break these silos down.
Well, I think there's been billions of dollars invested in HR technology development just since 2022.
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't we doing more of this now? Why aren't we building HR technology that makes this easier? Why, if it really is that impactful, which again, I violently agree with you that it is, and I've written a whole book on how to do it effectively that's coming out later this year. But why aren't we investing there? Why are we investing in the next, recruiting app that doesn't make it makes it moderately easier to recruit people?
Oh, I think one is low-hanging fruit. It's a lot easier to replace existing things than it is to get companies to do something entirely new. So from a vendor perspective, now I will say, and I don't mention vendor or companies in name, but I am working with a company specifically just because they're focused on measuring quality of hire. And I have a book coming out on quality of hire too. It's more of a book.
Look at you, fancy. I tried to tee you up earlier. You wouldn't take the bait.
I tell you, I want to say too, it's organic written. It's all organic text, no artificial text in my book. Thank you very much. Well, except for part of the appendix, but the main part of the book, all organic.
Nobody reads the appendix anyway,
Yeah, exactly. So there is stuff being done, but I think your question's a really good one. And why do I think it is? I think that on the vendor side, it's two things. One, customers aren't asking for it. If people were asking for it, they would build it, but they're not being asked for it. And because they're not being asked for it, it's far easier to just play in your existing silo and replace existing practices than trying to get a company to operate differently than it had in its past. And it is complicated stuff too. I will say historically we didn't do it because it would have been really, really hard. But now as everything moves to the cloud, the issue is not, this is a very solvable problem now with everything moved to the cloud technology. It wasn't when we were all in on-prem distributed systems. But then on the company side, I think it's two things. I think one of it is companies have lived this way for so long that they don't realize it could be better. They're just well, we've never done that. And why would we do it? We've never done it. So they haven't really challenged themselves. And I think that's where HR could play a big read, is HR being more upfront to say, we can't actually show you the value of our solutions until we can link it to this data. And we want to, but there's a certain vulnerability in doing that. And I do think on a more, I don't know if this is a dark side thing, at least on customer service jobs, which going back to your AI thing, what we're going to see is we're going to see massive growth in customer service jobs as a result of AI, because all these manufacturing jobs and stuff are going to be automated and automated and automated, and other things, knowledge worker jobs are being automated. As a society, with the exception of sales, and that's historically, we massively undervalue customer service work. And if companies started to link these solutions together, it would imply if they understood the value of these people more, they'd have to pay them more. And and there's a way of like, this, having that
Yeah, so that's
understanding
the
would
point
almost.
about emotional labor that you made earlier,
Mhm.
and this is a big callback, but, I wrote an article a few years ago called "Everyone Gets Paid the Same," and it breaks down all the different facets of pay, and I say the one exception well, there's 2 exceptions to the rule. If you get paid in equity, that's not technically like dollars and cents. That has the ability to grow exponentially, not linearly necessarily. But the second is emotional labor, which
Mhm.
it is incredibly difficult labor, but it is not paid equitably to its difficulty.
Not at
And
all.
so it should be my only should in that theory is that emotional labor should be paid more than it is right now.
Absolutely. It has a huge impact. And it's going to, if we really, it's like examples prove why is like every retail clerk paid at the same hourly rate?
Mhm.
When in reality, we know there's huge differences. Anyone who's ever gone shopping, there's huge differences in the impact of these people. And some of their jobs require high levels of stress, but they're not rewarded for it because there's no mechanism to show that one is more valuable than the other currently. But you could do this. We are getting to the point where you could absolutely track when this employee worked this shift, we saw store sales go up by this amount, right? You could actually track that. And some companies are moving towards this. This is starting to happen. But historically, we just have these models of, oh, well, those are the people that are all paid the same. The whole concept, and it's interesting because a lot of this stuff in the book, actually, Talent Tectonics talks a lot about this. A lot of our conceptualizations of work are based on really outdated technology. So, like,
Mhm.
this hourly pay is a really good example. Why do we have hourly pay? We have hourly pay because with the technology of the early 1900s, that was the only way we could consistently measure what we thought might sort of be performance,
Yeah.
but in reality, showing up and being there for 8 hours doesn't mean you're getting anything done. It does mean you're giving your life. So I think somebody deserves compensation for it. But if that's where you stop, it's going back to what we talked to, you're paying people just to show up. Where I get into a lot of conversations, not so much on the equity ones, an interesting one. That's just one because I happen to do a lot of work in equity and basically was getting very concerned about resistance I was seeing rising against, which are basically things we should do. We should try to make feel welcome, belong, supported. Going back to the other tectonic shift demographics, we can't afford to not take advantage of all the potential of people in our society. And there's like I get angry when I hear, I don't always express it, but internally I get angry when I hear people say declining birth rates are bad for economies. That's not true. One, declining birth rates are good for our planet. But the other one is they're bad for economies that historically depended on exploiting large amounts of underemployed people.
Yeah.
We have enough people in society to do the work that needs to be done, but we are not effectively leveraging all the people we have in society. There's a saying that potential is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. And that's
Mhm.
absolutely true. And that's particularly true still with women that are underutilized, people from other sort of like, historically disenfranchised groups. And that's what these done well, diversity programs are really about helping people that are facing challenges that we're not familiar with. You know,
Yeah.
like remote work is a really good example. Remote work is one of the most inclusive things that's happened in our lifetime. I was the employment of people with disabilities after coming out of the pandemic is the highest it's ever been in our country. And I remember before the pandemic, I know somebody is legally blind. She's a programmer. She goes, I can work, because most legally blind people aren't 100% blind. She goes, I've got all this special stuff at home so I can program, but asking me to commute, that's a game changer. And the question is, what's more important, what's in my head or where my ability to get my head into an office every day? This is one of these things where I really like exploring how can we use technology to rethink work that makes it more inclusive and supportive so we can leverage everyone in our society. And the book talks quite a bit about this, but I think remote work is a great example because there's nothing natural about commuting into offices every day. The only reason often when I'm talking about remote work, I start by showing a picture of the British Admiralty building in Greenwich, England that was built in 1700, I think.
Mhm.
And I gotta say, what's interesting about this building, it was the very first purpose-built office building in England. It was the very first time, before that where people worked were farms or factories or places where they lived. It was the very first building that was ever built so people could commute to it every day and have meetings. And it's like, well, why did they build it? Right. Why did they create this thing? Well, in 1700, the British Navy was becoming this highly complex global organization, and they needed better ways to communicate and collaborate. So, taking into account the communication technology available in 1700, they invented the office building. It's a form of communication technology. That's what it is. Just like Zoom, Teams, email, and just like any form of communication technology, it's got its strengths and it's got its weaknesses. You can over rely on email, you can over rely on the office for sure. But it got so widely adopted that people forgot it even was a form of technology. And it took a pandemic for society to realize that we weren't using this technology because it was effective. We were doing it because it was familiar.
We were doing it to treat people like homeroom and take roll.
Well, right, the dark side
I
of it.
guess for the British, the carrier pigeons just weren't cutting it
Yeah,
for communication any longer.
exactly. But there's a whole dark side. You're hitting. There's a whole dark side of this, and so we had this. And I think long term we are going to go to more hybrid, flexible work. That's just because you never hear people under the age. I mean, this is going back to it. One of the changes where there are differences in generations is attitudes towards technology. People get comfortable with the technology that they used when they grew up. I remember when I was in grad school and email started coming out, and you had people that would have their administrative assistants print out their email because it ain't natural to read on a screen, and I'll tell you, none of those people were under the age of 35. Now I think with remote hybrid work,
I'm printing out my emails all the time. I can't help it.
All the time. Yeah. I just like killing trees.
Yeah.
But
can't stop.
But getting into this issue, this is what there's so much of the Talent Tectonics gets into, and by work in general, though, is like our understanding of technology enables and constrains our imagination of how we could do work. So the example of going back to why don't we link employee data to business data? Well, because historically the technology made it almost impossible to do. But if people understood modern technology, I think you'll see this break down. It's the same thing with remote work. People didn't realize that we had technology that would allow us to work that way. It took a pandemic for us to realize it. But you're seeing this in performance management, that the annual performance review. I don't think anyone ever intentionally said we should give employees feedback one time a year, but when all you had was paper and pencil, it was the best they could do in a scalable way. So it's fascinating when you look at technology, how much technology, when we really use it to rethink how we could work, how much of the work that we do isn't done because it's effective. It's done because it's familiar, and it's familiar because it's based on really old systems.
Can I ask you one thing before we go to Cole's Corner real quick? You were saying something earlier about declining birth rates, and a colleague of mine, Ron Hetrick, has done some really great research called The Rising Storm. One of the things it talks about is the impacts of declining birth rates on the economy and the ability to staff things like nurses or, key professionals that keep the economy going. But one of the things that I think about is one of my diagnosis of the 2008 financial crisis. It wasn't just that, Wall Street had gone crazy. The reason why, the bottom came out from the economy is because there were literally more houses built than humans to live in them. Right. And because of that, they built out whole neighborhoods in Florida and Las Vegas and outside Chicago. And there was lots of neighborhoods that just people were buying second and third homes with loans that they should have never gotten and things like that. And so there was a lot of overbuilding that happened that fundamentally, made the prices of real estate crash all of a sudden. And I wonder, if we have declining birth rates, what will that do to the value of real estate, in your opinion? Because if there's not enough humans to live in the homes that are there anymore, do they essentially become worthless?
Well, I think part of the issue too, though, that there's huge differences in that depending on, I live in Oregon, that we never had that problem. We've always had a shortage of housing. So
it was very regional.
That people were building spec houses in places where no one wanted to live on this theory that people would move there. So I think that's my view is, well, currently we have we need more housing in a lot of parts of at least the United States than we have. I think in declining
Sure.
birth rates is going to play out over time. I'm not really the how I'm completely out of my field to talk about the housing market, but I obviously
Sure.
I always joke.
The only reason why I ask is 'cause it actually ties to the remote versus in-person debate, because one of the theories that we've talked about before on the podcast is they're afraid that a lot of the corporate real estate's value essentially plummets to zero, and if it does plummet to zero because everybody goes remote forever, that essentially will destroy the economy.
No,
And so I wonder if those things are related in some respect.
I don't think so. I think that's a lot of speculation. I think most companies, like when the real estate, it's a sunk cost, right? They've already spent the money. So I do think what drives a lot of these people return to work is it's depressing if you're an executive to that rare time you come into the office. That's always funny too. The people that always demand everyone's in the office every day usually aren't in the office every day. But when they
Sure.
come in, it's
They
depressing to
fly
walk.
from San Diego to Seattle to be
Yeah.
the
And
Chipotle.
yeah, and but it's depressing to walk through an office that's got a bunch of empty cubicles and they want to like, where are my people? Right. I think this is just
Yeah.
my own view. I think there's a big ego component to it.
Well, I remember I worked for a company who was fully remote, and we were trying to get investment at the time, and the CEO called everybody to go into the office when investors would visit, just to make it seem like there was a buzz about the office.
Yeah. And I think people like that. But I also must say too, hybrid work doesn't mean not coming into the office ever, right? It's really important to get people together in
Sure.
person. So, I'm not like, oh, you should never tell people to come into the office, but it should be very mindful. I mean, there's a cost to making people come into an office, and it should be very planful. You don't want to just to come in and have them put headphones on and sit next to each other and not talk to each other. That's not good for anyone. So it's more like thinking of an office space as a form of communication technology, just like we think of a phone or FaceTime or video type. Be mindful in the use of this tool in this space. So to your point about, do I think it's tied to real estate? Large scale, I would say it's really good for us to allow people to have flexibility in where they live. It's a much better use of the labor market. You do a lot of work with labor market statistics.
Mhm.
It's there's a lot of people that could work but don't work because they can't afford to commute. They can't afford the distance of the commute. And usually the people that are punished the worst by the commute are the people that can least afford to do it. There's, a lot of going back to gender equity in our society, this is whether right or wrong, this is just how it is. Women tend to be the primary family caregiver. And
Yeah.
if you're the person that has to pick the son up or daughter up from school and they're sick, the ability to work remotely can be the difference between your ability to work and balance your obligations as a parent versus either not being able to work or working and being totally stressed out because you feel like you're not balancing your obligations as a parent. So giving people flexibility like that is inherently good. It's a better use of the labor market.
Mm.
It's, we get this whole thing. It's like why we're moving towards skills-based hiring and kind of moving away from degrees, Although I don't know about you, Cole, but I still want to say, but except for PhDs, if people have PhDs, you should pay attention to them.
Don't you just, don't you treat us PhDs badly, right? Uh,
That's doctor to you, please.
yeah. It's Dr. Steve Hunt.
I always tell people that they can call me doctor twice, and after that, it's obnoxious.
Yeah.
But I mean, this whole move to skills based is also breaking down historical. Oh, you need a college degree, or oh, you need a high school degree, which was just. It was why would companies do that in the past? Well, part of it was they didn't have any way to measure skills. And so it was kind of a rough proxy for skills. We kind of assumed, oh, if you have a college degree, you must be able to write, which is not necessarily true, having taught undergrads. But
Well, it probably was true at one point. It's just not true anymore.
yeah, maybe not. Yeah. So now we have technology that enables us to measure skills at a much more detailed level, which allows us to get rid of a lot of the historic ways that we hire people. But that's really good because it allows us much better use of the labor market overall. So whenever I see, in general, if there's anything that you can do that gives employees more control over how they work, that's good, provided you also have really good tools for measuring whether or not they're getting the work done. And that's where
we don't have, as we've clarified earlier.
Well, we could and we do, but they're not effectively used. Like, well, Cole, I'll ask you this. This is my view, probably the single most underutilized tool for workforce management is goals,
Okay. Say
effective
more.
goal setting. That I have literally been in conversations with business leaders to say, psychological research shows that people are more likely to do what you want them to do if you tell them what it is you want them to do. you
Sure.
know and that sounds ridiculous, but if you go in and you've done employee surveys and ask employees, is it clear to you what you're supposed to do and how you're going to be evaluated and whether or not you're be able to show the accomplishments, employees will tell you again and again, it is not clear to me what the company wants me to do. I am not given regular feedback on doing it in a way that's constructive, that feels like coaching and support as opposed to punishment. But we have the psychological knowledge. We know tons about how to effectively use goals, how to use them for feedback, how to use them for coaching, how to support them, how to make talent decisions. We have massive knowledge on that, and it's not new. We've known it for a long time. It's not used. I use the analogy I often use to workforce management is it's like managing your own health. If you ask a doctor, what do I need to do to lose weight? They know exactly what you need to do. You need to manage your diet and manage your exercise, right? And it's usually eat less, exercise more for most of us. What's the problem? We don't do it. The issue isn't knowing what to do. And that's when you look at companies so much. My second book was called Common Sense Talent Management. And that's why I called it Common Sense Talent Management, that most of the really effective things for increasing workforce performance and employee engagement are just doing simple things consistently. But people keep looking for magic things. So like the remote work is an example. Oh, our productivity is down. Well, have you set people clear goals? Why? If you need to see people to know if they're doing a good job, you are a lousy manager unless you're managing ballet dancers. Yeah.
Is that one of your aspirations, Steve?
To be a ballet dancer? No. My wife, yes. My wife, that's one of the things she wants to do in retirement. She wants to be one of the, like you go to a ballet, there's people that stand in the background on stage. They don't actually dance. They're just like, oh, they're having a big party. And there's all this. She goes, I want to be one of those people because she did ballet as a little girl. And she has accepted that, okay, well, my chances of being a professional ballerina, those pretty much aren't there. But I can still get on stage.
Well, I mean, that's a goal. It's got measurable results. She could, she might not get burned out doing it. All the things that we talked about throughout the podcast so far. But well, Steve, do you want to join me in Cole's Corner?
Sure. Yeah.
Welcome to Cole's Corner. So I've got a few rapid fire questions for you. The first is, which is better? And I think I know the answer, but I want to hear your justification. Hair metal, grunge, Metallica, or country, and why?
I'm going to surprise you. I'm going to say country, but it has to be good country music. There's a lot of schlocky country music, including country music that sounds like grunge. I was at the Grand Ole Opry, and a guy was up there playing through a Gibson Les Paul and a Marshall Stack, singing about how he was real country. I'm like, what the heck? Sounding like with distortion. I'm like, there's nothing real country about what you're playing. You're a grunge musician playing country music. No, why country? I think that country music, like, Hank Williams, Johnny Cash, a lot of the alt country stuff, if it's done really well, it is really beautifully crafted music and lyricism. Now, you can find great music in all genres. I like all of those genres and their different styles. But if I have to say the one where you just hear the most amazing musicianship, you think of like Chet Atkins, I'm a guitar player, that they don't have any distortion, they don't have any effects. And a lot of that music has really stood the test of time. Where they're really speaking. And I'm saying the caveat big here is, if I had to say if you took the best of any of those genres, I would have to say, if I had to say the stuff that is most to me artistically impressive is the best, it would be really, really good country music. That said, I love all that stuff. But that's just me.
Yeah.
By the way, I listen to the others more. I don't listen to country music that often, but I appreciate it. Yeah.
You and Jim Henderson would get along because he taught us like all these country musicians I'd never heard of. So the next question I got for you is, what's the place you've never been to that you'd most like to go and why?
Patagonia.
Okay, so down in Chile.
Yeah, something up. Because when I was growing up, my mom had a poster that had a picture of the Patagonia Mountains. And this is
Mhm.
before Patagonia, the brand, existed. And I've just always had that image in my head. So someday I'll get there.
Yeah. We watch a lot of those, like, Planet Earth type things with my
Yeah.
kids, and I believe there's llamas there. So if you wanna go see some llamas in the Patagonia Mountains, you could be
That
on
sounds
that
like
show.
heaven, a field with llamas. And yeah. So yeah, I'm going to get there someday.
There you go. Why do you do what you do?
I think it's a partially it's a reflection certainly of my upbringing. I grew up around psychology and computers and those sorts of things. So it definitely influenced me. I always joked, I say that if psychology, my mom was a counseling psychologist that did mid-career counseling, and my dad was a cognitive psychologist, and pretty well known actually in the field of cognitive psychology. But I always joked that if psychology is genetic, it's a recessive trait because I'm one of four and I'm the only one that went into psychology. My brother was a biophysicist, my other brother's a commercial real estate salesman, and my sister was a clown. so,
As
uh,
one does.
yeah, as
Yeah.
one does. But my sort of credo is, and better work environments create better world environments. I mean, if you look at what makes people happy in life, it's, health, social relationships, and experiences. Well, the biggest experience that defines a lot of people's lives is their work, and their work affects their health and their family and social relationships. And we can do so much more to make work better and do it again. It's not an employee versus employer kind of thing. It's good for both of them if we manage that. And I've worked with companies that have struck that balance. And it is just a wonderful thing when you see people. I mean, when an organization it's a group of people collaborating using shared resources to get something done they couldn't do by themselves. It's like humanity at its best when it comes together. And it it's funny. One of the things I talk about, like why I work and write and all this, I joke sometimes my muses for writing are anger and arrogance. Anger, anger that the world's going about doing things the wrong way when it comes to work, and arrogance that I know the right way to do it. But I would say when I know what the stuff
Good motivation. I actually share those
do you,
those muses. Yeah, it's really because otherwise you wouldn't write anything. You're like,
no, I'm like
what's
pounding the keyboard. but and I say, the stuff that I know, basically, it's not me knowing. It's I read a lot. Now, I would say the bulk of like advice that I give to companies, it's based on things I have seen from my experience or stuff that I know as a psychologist or a technologist. But it's it really is. If we can, we have the ability to give everyone on this planet, I believe, a healthy, successful, meaningful career. It is within the capability of our society, given our resources and technology. I'm saying, yes, this is a tall order to do, but it's possible. Just like it'd be possible to feed everyone on the planet. We have the resources as a society so that no one ever need go hungry. The challenge is how do we effectively achieve that? And that's probably that really is what motivates me. I mean, plus at a high level, meta level. At a lower level, I just love this stuff. I just find it fascinating. I'm just geek out about it. I could talk about, you know, don't ask me about performance rating scales. I can talk about that for a long time.
Well, I got one big question for you. And so we haven't dug into it too much today, but you've alluded to it a little bit, but you worked a lot of your career in the HR technology space. And so the question I've got for you is if you were creating an HR technology startup today, what would it be focused on? Would it be related to AI in some way? And how would you ensure that it was successful?
Well, from a marketing standpoint, if it had nothing to do with AI, I'd still say it was related to AI.
That's part of the answer. That's a good answer.
Well, actually, the funny thing too is I was on a panel that was talking about the legality of AI, and we talked so much about how poorly defined it is, and these things that like make AI illegal is like making math illegal. It's like no, it's not well defined. But
I'm
what would
here
I
to
do?
sell
That's
sand AI.
yeah,
Sand, but it's AI.
exactly. I A company, what would I focus? Well, I say I am working right now. In my current role, I'm like, I worked for a really big, massive technology company, and for a variety of reasons decided to leave there. And what I've been doing since actually is working with startups that are doing stuff that if I start one up, I would do. So there's this one that's focused on quality of hire, because I think that gets that whole idea. Quality of hire is about matching how we hire and onboard people to the performance and the contribution they make to the organization. It was the very topic we were talking about before. And nothing good comes from putting people in jobs where they can't be successful. And, don't blame the employee. If somebody fails in the first year, it's not their fault. You shouldn't have something about your hiring process or onboarding process is screwed up. Don't blame them. So that's an example of a company I'm working with. I'm working with another company that does what is called collaborative learning, which I think is be really, really critical as we automate more in our AI. What it's about, it's technology that is designed to get information out of the heads of one expert and get it into the minds of other people. And if you think about a big concern with these generative AI agents is when you automate something, AI can only automate things that are digitally captured. But often the most important knowledge and expertise isn't captured. It's in somebody's head. And that's what you need to find a way to retain when you use AI to automate work. And that's kind of so this focus on this is technology that wasn't originally developed with AI specifically in mind, but it's a technology I think it'll be really, really critical as we start very rapidly automating jobs. Because as you pointed out earlier, the companies are rushing towards get that AI in and reduce headcount costs. It's like, well, once these people walk out of the door, they're taking the stuff that's in their head too, that the AI did not capture. And that's the expertise that really matters. So that's an interesting one. I think but I could go on and on. There's so many fascinating ones. In every single area, I think there's going to be more stuff. And I think the metaverse is going to come back in some ways with virtual reality and in a different way. I think as all these technologies get hyped, certainly skills. I think one of the things that we need better association between skills, job objectives, and cost centers. So that if a manager, a lot of companies are saying, oh, would it be great if we had this gig economy where employees could work part-time on this project and part-time on that project and they weren't constrained by their job roles? They hear a lot about this skills-based work. When I talk to companies about that, the managers are like, look, if I lend this employee to that other project, I have nothing against it except for it's my headcount budget and I'm not getting headcount budget back or having my goals reduced. So if you had an ability to say, we're going to allow companies to lend people around to different projects, but when they go to those projects, their cost center information is going to go so that as a manager, you get credit for sharing talent. You're not punished for it. So that's another one. I don't know. I could go on and on. Sure. There's a zillion.
Steve, I'm not investing in any of your startups. I'm investing in Sand AI. It sounds like it's definitely going to work out for sure.
Sand AI. What is Sand AI?
Sand AI. It's just, sand, but with AI. So, we figured it out. It's going to work.
AI was that's brilliant. I'm going to go for water AI.
Yeah. Well, rock covers scissors or whatever. So yeah, we're going to figure it all out.
You remember?
All right. I got a few articles for you about what I'm reading, Steve. So the first one is from Minerva Psychology. I really appreciate what they're doing. They basically just take articles as they come out and they summarize them for the masses, which is a need, I think, in our research. And so this is an article from Chelsea Song et al. 2025 about, is the relationship between personality and work performance sort of curvy? And I was going to call back to something you were saying earlier in here, because the biggest relationship between personality and work performance is conscientiousness. Mm-hmm. And I had a professor in grad school who always talked about, well, of course, conscientiousness and work performance are related, because if you don't show up to the job, you're not going to be able to do the job effectively. And so basically, he just said conscientiousness does nothing to predict work performance. It's just, do you show up or do you not show up?
Well, that's part of performance.
Yeah, exactly. And we can't even measure performance, so it's all for naught. But what they found here is that there's actually a curvilinear relationship between all the big five characteristics and work performance. So it's not just this linear relationship that we've always proposed. And the most curvy of all was conscientiousness. So they looked at the dimensions, but also some of the subfacets of conscientiousness as well. And I don't know, what were your thoughts when you got a chance to read this?
I totally agree with it. It goes back to earlier in my career, I built personality assessments and stuff like that. I actually, in my undergrad degree, my graduate work, a lot of it was studying personality predictors of job performance and hourly, like frontline jobs. And I saw this, but you saw it I think at the time you saw it, but it was like very small incremental levels. It didn't jump out at you. But I do agree with that. I've seen, like, not only is it curvilinear, it's interesting because it's multidimensional. It's relationship performance. So I give an example: risk taking. Like, one of these things. These when I was studying retail jobs, that if you ask people, do you like to take risks, right? That was actually a positive predictor for sales because it was sort of like extroversion, outgoingness, but it was a negative
Yeah.
predictor for other things. So that's not curvilinear per se, but it does say that there's an optimal level of risk taking. You know, you kind of want to balance. We want you to take risks, but not too much.
It is
And
probably correlated to whether people wanna go whitewater rafting too, I
yeah,
imagine.
yeah. So, and I think the conscientiousness is a really good example. That if you go also on that, it's like at a certain point, you don't want just people like having functional fixation. You know, sometimes it's like at a certain point, it's not worth getting that thing done, right? Let it go. I think that makes sense to me, that you could be too conscientious. I will say too, and
Well,
that
that was the funny thing that I took away from it is it actually showed it's not a linear relationship, and I expected it to be curvilinear, like, the more conscientious you got, it kinda leveled off,
yeah.
but it was actually the opposite finding, which is the most conscientious people actually had the highest relationship, which is not what I was expecting.
Well, I think on this, you have to look at what is the performance criteria. You
True.
know, it's, you're going to find it depending on the job. And that's always a big thing. Whenever you look at personality in general, there's no universally best personality. It depends on what you're doing for, which, if you got into the evolutionary reason for personality, that makes sense. We have different personalities because it was adaptability to different environments over time. At least that's what one would argue. And that means that there is no ideal personality. It depends on the environment that you're in.
Yeah.
I think there are probably some personality types now that don't do well in modern society, but that is a different topic entirely.
Yeah.
I will tell you the thing that this triggered with me, and I shared it with you when you sent the article, is actually I was involved in a company called Unicrew that was bought by Kronos that actually did some of the very first machine learning back in like 2006. You know, we did hourly, where we would, get information on like retail associates, and we track how long they stayed in the job and how much they sold, and then we would feed it back in, and we were processing like 25,000 applicants a day. I mean, but the technology was
You were
2006.
doing it all on, like, TI-89 calculators?
Yeah, it was just ignorant. But we did find like curvilinear relationships, and even more interesting was we found really fascinating interactions. And like one that I thought was really cool was, and it was like like a retail, like shoe salesman in a mall kind of job. And you say, okay, well, you want people to be agreeable. That is, to get along with each other, other people. That would be predictive of that job. Probably the other one was, are you socially outgoing? Do you start up conversations with people? Stuff like that. And you say, okay, well, those two things, yeah, that makes sense. And we put them into the assessment. And they did predict performance in general. You know, if you weren't agreeable, you were a bad salesperson. If you didn't have no social confidence, you were a bad salesperson. But the best salespeople were actually mid-level agreeable and very high socially confident. They didn't want to be your friend. They wanted to sell you shoes, right? And so it was interesting that in that case,
They
the
had goals,
opposite,
right? And they
yeah,
were sticking to the goal.
they were sticking to the goals. My job is not to make friends. My job is to sell you stuff. And it was interesting because what it said is the best employee was not the opposite of the worst employee,
Yeah.
which
It's
is
like
kind of
every
cool.
reality TV show, the person gets on the show and they say, "I'm not here to make friends, I'm here to win." You know?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, it is. And I was sometimes, having worked with zillions of salespeople in my career, which I say this with the greatest respect, the thing that makes salespeople really effective is what makes them annoying. They're very task focused.
yeah, I'm sure they're very conscientious too, and that's why you see the little tail upwards. Um,
Not in the way that most people think of conscientious. Some of them are.
yeah, but they will follow up a million times.
They're very goal focused. Yes, very.
Yep, absolutely. Well, the next one I've got for you is a piece about, and it's very much related to our conversation today about the effectiveness of the work and how can we measure the effectiveness. And so it's by a guy named John Whitfield made a post about, is it time to move beyond Kirkpatrick and Phillips models for measuring L&D effectiveness? And so he cites some research that shows between 10 and 40% of the investment in L&D programs, only about that much of the investment actually translates to lasting behavioral change. So very, very low relationship there. And one of the things that they talk about is just, is it time to just focus on training outcomes, like taking an outcome focused evaluation to the methods? Because if you're just looking at things like, did people feel a sense of achievement, or did they feel good about the training? Is that really going to, create this ROI that we're looking for in the workplace? So I don't know. Before I comment on it, do you have any thoughts about this one?
I read it and it didn't really feel like it was saying anything, to be honest. No criticism of the person for that. New to me that we should measure the outcome and impact of training. Well, whoa, hold the press.
Yeah.
So I think the Kirkpatrick's model. I think the problem with Kirkpatrick's model, it kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier, which we don't pay people to be happy. We pay people to get stuff done, but if they're not happy, they're probably not likely to get it done, kind of thing.
Yeah.
That by having these lower order metrics that really aren't that valuable, people satisfy with it, and you could make an argument that who cares if they like the training? Although I personally think, if you can't even make the training enjoyable, come on. I mean, on the flip side, I think this was on one of your podcasts recently, that sometimes the thing that helps people learning are not necessarily enjoyable. Didn't you? Check me on this because I can't remember the name, but I remember you were talking to somebody who said that one of the most effective parts of their training was forcing executives to take tests.
Yeah, I recall that somebody saying that. I can't remember what episode it was.
Which they hated. They said they hated it.
Yeah.
They hated it because it forced them to realize they didn't know everything. And so I think in that point, I think the person, if I was to put a spin on this article, what I'd say is the most sort of what could be a really interesting argument that they could make is not that Kirkpatrick is not good or bad, but to say that the goal of training isn't necessarily to make people happy. And in fact, there are certain aspects of learning that probably are extremely discomfortable. And that by having this idea that we focus on smile sheets, it's not just not that valuable, it could also lead you to making suboptimal training.
Yeah, it's funny. So an episode that hasn't come out yet, but that Scott and I have recorded, I talk about some research that I've done that actually shows if you look at Kirkpatrick's level 3, which is just like, did the training transfer onto the job? It's actually inversely correlated with level 1, which is how good people feel about it.
Yeah.
So if you feel really good about it, they're like, from the work that I've done in the past, you're actually less likely to transfer the training into the real world, and vice versa. And so really all I always tell people, all I ever care about is level 3 of Kirkpatrick, and that's it.
Yeah. And I think that's a good argument. And that's not what this article says. I think this article would be better if it was more what you just said, which is to say, and I think if you went back, and I haven't read Kirkpatrick in years, I think we're not necessarily saying anything that he wouldn't agree with. I think that's a really, really good point. And I always use these analogies, right, to help too. It's like, the best workouts that are going to make you perform well in the match usually are not pleasant.
Mm-hmm.
As my high school gym teacher would always say, no pain, no gain, right?
All right. Well, I'll hit you with this last one really quick because this has been one of our longer episodes. It's been sort of a marathon today. But last article I'm reading right now is from friend of the podcast, previous guest, Amit Mohindra. He wrote an article, "Who is the human in the loop?" And so he starts the article out by saying, every AI discussion invariably reaches a point where someone says, yes, but there has to be a human in the loop, right? Because the human is there for oversight. But the question is left out, who is that human that's in the loop? He goes on and elaborates much more on this topic. But the principle is that the human that's described is likely some kind of data scientist who is looking at the models, training the models, looking to see if there's any kind of bias and the like. But what that does is it cuts out the traditional decision maker. So imagine you're a hiring manager. You presumably are the one making the final decision on who to hire. But if you have a model who's making decisions on who to hire, and with no hiring manager input, if there is a human in the loop, it's probably not the hiring manager anymore. It's some data scientist. And therefore, the data scientist becomes the real decision maker, not the hiring manager anymore. And so I thought this was a fascinating part of the AI discussion that really no one's talking about. And again, knowing that your dad wrote a book on AI, and you've worked at a lot of companies who are doing a lot of work in this space over the years, and you used your TI-89 in 2006 to look at the curvilinear relationships between personality and job performance. I wondered what your perspective on it was, Steve.
I am actually writing a article on this very topic. I found this was really interesting. And it is this idea of what's the future of these humans in the loop. And the point that I started out on this is that if we go with the assumption that we're going to use AI as much as we possibly can, which we probably are more and more and more, then you have to say, well, what is that AI can never do? And this kind of gets a little philosophical, but it's the two things I would argue that AI can never do is one, it can never care for people,
Mm-hmm.
because caring fundamentally is defined as a person giving their life in the form of time and attention to the well-being of another person. It's an organic process. I always use the example of it's like when you get on that stupid AI phone tree, press 3, press 4, and you're like, I just want to talk to a person. When you finally get a person on the phone, you feel better even if they can't help you because, and so I think one of the things we're always going to need humans in the loop to give this sense of caring. But a lot of the other tasks, it's almost like it's like humans in the loop will be like salt in a meal. There's like the right amount. If it's missing, the meal's lousy, but you don't want to put too much in it, right? So it's like, I think that, and that's going to be a really fascinating thing, figuring out how do we strategically use humans in the loop for caring. But the other thing, and I say this is related to caring, is AI cannot imagine. And, people are like, well, it can come up with new ideas and stuff, in the sense that AI can solve any problem we put at it, and it can keep focusing on it. It's sort of like it can climb any mountain, probably eventually better than we can, and figure a way up. But it cannot decide what mountains to climb, and it can't imagine mountains that don't even exist that it might climb. And I would say that's another human thing, and I'd say that's tied back to our sense of actually mortality as people, that we imagine a better world for ourselves and those we love with because we care about ourselves and we care about those that we love. And imagination, which is the fundamental foundation of creativity and innovation, that's something AI can't do. And so I think the future of humans in the loop is going to be, how do we create jobs that really allow people to be really caring humans, going back to your emotional labor being undervalued. I think the future of work is going to be a lot of emotional labor jobs, which is highly skilled, by the way. I hate the fact that it's it's a trainable skill, it's resilience, all these things. So I think the future of humans in the loop is going to be around caring. And I think the future of humans in the loop is going to be about imagination, but imagination is going to require really strong technical understanding. And that's where we're going to have it's going to be fascinating, because companies, how do you create senior level experts when there are no junior expert jobs? Because all of those will be automated. So I think, optimistic that I am, that you can increasingly see companies create jobs where the purpose of the job is, well, you're going to do stuff that AI could do, but we're going to have you do it because we need somebody to learn how to become an expert. And the only way to become an expert is to actually do the work.
I love this. Makes me think, I think this was like right when ChatGPT came out. We covered a slide on the podcast from IBM in 1970.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just a single phrase, and it said, computers, and you could insert AI here, but computers can't make decisions because computers can't be held accountable.
But that's exactly, as computers can't care. And I use that example that it affects not just the use of it, it also affects our adoption. Like, why don't we embrace self-driving cars? We have the technologies, that's AI, by the way, too. We have the technology to have self-driving cars. Why do people resist it? Because we are more forgiving of humans having accidents than we are of machines, because humans can feel remorse and guilt and machines don't care. And we also imagine we're better drivers in the car, even though we aren't.
Resistance is futile, Steve. We all are going to be forced to be in driverless cars soon. Just get ready.
I'm okay with it. I hate driving.
Yeah. Well, Steve, you've been a fantastic guest today. Any final words, and you want to share where people can find you for anybody listening?
Yeah, well, I think the easiest place to find me is on LinkedIn, Stephen T. Hunt, PhD. I also have a little LLC called i3 Talent. I also, Talent Tectonics is the book. If you search on Talent Tectonics, you'll find me. And, if you found the stuff I'm talking about, you want to talk to me, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I don't know if it shows, but cool. I love talking about the stuff. I love learning about the stuff. And I really love what you're doing with Directionally Correct. And it's just kind of advancing this conversation. It was really an honor for me to have a chance to appear on the show. I'm a long-time listener, first-time guest. I feel pretty psyched.
Thanks for being a listener, and thanks for joining us, Steve. You've been listening to Directionally Correct, a People X podcast with Cole and Scott, and today's guest, Steve Hunt. Thanks for joining us, Steve.